Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is we're going to try to cover the first 14 verses in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, this marks the first of three and a fraction of narrative divisions in the fourth chapter. Its successor is ultimately a warning against idolatry, and the final full section is a witness to the singularity and uniqueness of their Elohim. And the final 3 or 4 verses, not quite the same length, so not fully worthy of the appellation section, is an explanation for the purpose of the sanctuary cities. But some of these concepts bleed over. We read warnings of idolatry in some of the verses we're going to cover today, and ultimately the witness of that is the type of witness that is in the fourth chapter in that specific section is of his nature and attributes, whereas our witness of him is best expressed in obedience. And true story, the original literary divisions of the scriptures were arranged in paragraph forms, just like any other book. It was not until the year 1328 that with the formation of the Latin Vulgate that the chapters and verses as we know them came to be. And ultimately, this was a system to help theologians or readers more efficiently locate identifiable words or verses or themes or concepts. But the practice, and with that in mind, the practice I wish to encourage is to always, always, always be mindful of the macrocosm when dissecting the microcosm. There's a tendency to get lost in the minutiae of details, and that's an excessive extreme we should avoid. So by that, be mindful of its relation to its antecedent and predecessor, as well as its successor, as well as you delve deeper and deeper in scriptures and become more familiar with them, you'll start to notice similar concepts reiterated elsewhere, and different sentiments too, and you'll start to write them down. Now, many study Bibles do in fact have sections where they list verses on the side of one page which overlap or parallel others, but I honestly find the most satisfaction was to find them out on my own, and we're going to read of that in as early as verse 2, which is also, but before we get to that, I think we should open with its predecessor. And now, O Israel, listen to the laws and the judgments which I am teaching you to do, so that you live and go in and possess the land which Yahweh Elohim of your fathers has given you. Now, the word listen in this context entails more than merely hearing. That would be the analogous equivalent, merely hearing, that is, of walking with sight, whereas listening in this context involves all of one's faculties and all their capacities. It's to absorb what you hear and express it through action as witness or testament that you have in fact listened. And this word, it appears a little over 100 times in the book of Deuteronomy alone. So listening was key, and it's through listening that we're ultimately able to one witness to the one we witness to and encourage others to listen to our witness. And this listening was for a purpose identified for the purpose of life and land, and it was ultimately a gift. They recently escaped exiles from Egypt. And do not add to the word which I command you, do not take away from it, so as to guard the commands of Yahweh your Elohim, which I am commanding you. Now, we had earlier mentioned that the Latin Vulgate technically doesn't violate this dictate in that it's a division, whereas they're expressly admonished not to add or take or subtract from, unless one counts the numbers by the side as an addition, but that's ultimately not really necessary. But an interesting line of argument comes up. Now, by the time of the dawn of what the secular historians call the dawn of the Common Era, or what is in scriptural terminology, the New Testament times, there had by the post-exilic period is really when they originated. Two mutually antagonistic sects in the Jewish ecclesiastic system rose and flourished, and those were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they both had different outlooks, but ultimately their outlooks were rooted in their approach to scriptures, in that in one sense, the Pharisees were the more conservative sect, in that they were bound by tradition and shackled by it, frankly, and were loyalist and separatist and patriots, and really advocates and defenders of the Israel ways. Whereas the Sadducees were more the equivalent of today's modern American liberal, in that they were culturally cosmopolitan and appeasers and collaborators by nature, and sophisticates. They formed the wealthier bunch. But in another sense, the Sadducees were the more conservative sect, in that they rejected the post-Pentateuchal books as non-canonical. And this brings to light an interesting argument, because one, in verse 12:32, we read Moses reiterate essentially the same concept, but we also read that Solomon, writing under the same influence of the Ruach Hadesh, which inspired Moses, was writing it. And also John in New Testament times, in Revelation 22:18-19, he reiterates a similar concept. So there are consequences for this more explicitly indicated in the other verses, but the gist of it is it's a command, so don't do it. The warnings aren't as explicit in this version of the concept as they are in maybe others, but especially the Revelation one. But the bottom line is don't do it. Now, your eyes have seen what Yahweh did at Baal Peor, for Yahweh your Elohim has destroyed from your midst all the men who followed Baal Peor. Now, Baal was a Canaanite deity, a fertility deity, I believe. He was a constant nuisance to the Israelites, who were constantly tempted to flirt with or indulge in idolatry from their pagan neighbors. And the New Testament, the Jews, at least in the biblical times, were never one prone for moderation. We witness that in the Old Testament times, they constantly indulged and relapsed in idolatry, whereas in the New Testament times, the Pharisees became shackled by tradition and militantly monotheistic. But ultimately it compelled them to elevate their man-made traditions, which were elaborate. They had books this thick on what one could and could not do on the Sabbath, and really they elevated their own tradition without authorization or inspiration. But the warning for idolatry was more immediately relevant for the Old Covenant people. But you who are clinging to Yahweh your Elohim are alive today, every one of you. Now, there were consequences for idolatry in the Exodus generation. Those who indulged were eradicated, wiped out, and not without warning and not without good reason, because they were commanded to keep themselves separate from the nations in the nation that they were going to inhabit, and in the nations around them. See, I have taught you laws and justice, as Yahweh my Elohim commanded me, to do thus in the land which you go to possess. Now Moses is ultimately not the creator of these laws, but the delegator thereof, and the authorized one from the supreme authority. And he ultimately would not, at the conclusion of Deuteronomy, we witnessed a lapse in disobedience, which ultimately disables him. He's able to gaze on the land, but ultimately not possess the land. So he was stuck with the Exodus generation through the whole way, and that marks the third of 40-year periods of his life. And you shall guard and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding before the eyes of the peoples who hear all these laws, and they say, only a wise and understanding people is this great nation. For what great nation is there which has Elohim so near to it, as Yahweh our Elohim is to us, whenever we call on him? And what great nation is there that has such laws and righteous rulings like all this Torah, which I put before you this day? Now the purpose of the law was both internal and external. It was to separate themselves from the nations so as to give them a witness of how to live. And the laws, whether righteous or sacred or ceremonial or moral or secular, were to be a witness of of its creator, their creator, the sole creator of heaven and earth. And a lot of people, they can impress themselves on the accumulation of wisdom, but at the end of the day, they cannot hope to surpass what's in this book or the source who inspired it, who cannot must necessarily conceal all that he knows in mystery, but has given us enough to work with for all that we need to know. That's not to discourage further intellectual inquiry or categorically exclude secondary sources. It's only to say keep this book the primary priority. Only guard yourself and guard life diligently, lest you forget the words your eyes have seen, and lest they turn aside from your heart all the days of your life, and you shall make them known to your children and your grandchildren. Now, the precepts in Scripture are eternal principles, so we have to respect that fact while respecting the fact that we on this side of mortality are not, and require periodic and regular and consistent refreshment of these eternal values in order to extract their most eternally efficacious value. In that it's really an all-day endeavor. I cannot stress that enough. A lot of people spend a moment in study or prayer and expect a lifetime of blessings, and that's ultimately an attempt to abuse one who should not, and in most cases cannot be manipulated as such. And they're charged to make them known to your children and grandchildren. The faith is never more than one generation away from extinction. That is incumbent upon us. It is absolutely essential that we teach these principles, because though they are eternal in themselves, they exist in the world and the flux and change in the world. There are forces aligned against this faith that want to see us frankly eradicated, so it's incumbent upon us not only to protect the faith and the fundamentals thereof, but to teach them to the next generation and try and win over some of those who are either indifferent on the sidelines or especially try to harm us. The day when you stood before Yahweh your Elohim at Horeb, Yahweh said to me, "Assemble the peoples to me, and I make them hear my words, so that they learn to fear me all the days they live on the earth, and teach their children." Now, fear in this context, I think it's a component of faith. Now, fear in its most general terms is something antithetical to faith, but I haven't exactly done the etymological underlaying that I did for the word listen, for example. But so I'm implicitly assuming that fear in this context is a component of faith, by which I mean that the fear of Yahweh is the fear that eliminates all other fears. So really the only thing we have to fear is fear itself when we're told to fear the Almighty. And this is a reference to a historical context. Horeb was a location of some significance during the Exodus, and Deuteronomy itself is ultimately a reiteration of the law. If you dissect the words, it's Deutero means second telling of the law. And you came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire to the heart of the heavens, darkness and cloud, dense cloud. So we understand this is a dramatic recapitulation of a dramatic event, which was physically impressive and spiritually significant. And Yahweh spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard a voice of words, but saw no form. You only heard a voice. And that's ultimately because he is invisible in essence, but he can make himself heard. He's a purely spiritual being whose invisible essence is manifested in the Son, but the Father and the Spirit are purely spiritative beings, but they can communicate through the senses, through the voice of words, but it's ultimately a rare distinction, or a physical voice, that is. He does the gentle promptings of the Spirit. Now, this is perhaps an oversimplification, but the easiest way to discern between the demonic and the divine promptings is that the adversary tends to inflame the emotions and manipulate the passions. So if you find yourself really excited about a decision of significance, it's maybe time to step back and really weigh the spirits and exercise discernment. And he made known to you his covenant, which he commanded you to do, the 10 words, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. And Yahweh commanded me at that time to teach you laws and right rulings, for you to do them in the land which you pass over to possess. Now the 10 words is translation for the 10 commandments, or the Decalogue, which really forms the heart of the law, but not the fullness thereof. There are in fact 613 laws in the Torah total. Now 365 of them are negative or prohibitions, 248 are positive precepts, but we ultimately don't have time to get into that today, but something worth picking up on next time. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.